Um, Thank you so much. I've just had a note from a participant that we are now live and broadcasting. So hello and welcome to the Creating Your Plan B webinar, which is part of the We Are Worthy Summit, which started today and runs till next Saturday. Thank you so much for joining us. We're just doing a few pre-flight checks while we launch, and hopefully launching to live streaming on Facebook. So thank you so much for joining this call. And yeah, I just had notification that we're now live streaming on Facebook. So welcome if you're joining us on Facebook. So my name is Jody and I'm the founder of Gateway Women. And this webinar is about creating your Plan B. Now, Plan B is a really huge topic, because really what Plan B is about is, what do I shape my life around if it's not having children, if it's not the identity of motherhood? This is one of the hardest aspects of kind of creating a life after childlessness, because for many of us, the dream of motherhood and perhaps trying to become a mother is something that we may have been involved in, for many, many years. I mean, my own story is that I started trying to conceive when I was 29, and I spent, the next 15 years trying to be a mum by various means. I actually when I got to the point when it was time to really consider fertility treatments, my marriage was melting down, and my marriage broke down at that point. I was 37, but I thought I still had time to kind of get out and meet someone and do IVF. Yeah, do IVF. That was what I thought. I thought it always worked, and I just needed to kind of find the willing and suitable male partner, and it was all still going to be okay. And I was completely ignorant about my fertility. I was completely ignorant about IVF. The fact is it fails 75% of the time. In fact, even for those who are in their mid-20s, I mean, many of us understand that the rates go down, success rates go down as we get older. But even if you're in your mid-20s, aged around 25, it has a 49% success rate. So do you know what I mean? It's kind of going to fail 50% of the time, even when you're in your mid-20s. And by the time you get to the age that I was, and many others are, which is our late 30s and early 40s, the success rates of IVF are shockingly low. And this is something that, most of us don't realize when we go into this world. And certainly the people who tell us about it all the time don't share with us. So it was a very long journey for me, really what felt like, some of the most prime years of my life, like the whole of my 30s and kind of the first few years of my 40s were focused on thinking about, dreaming about, planning, waiting, wanting, watching motherhood, and kind of psychologically nesting. So, I kind of wouldn't, every decision about my life and my future that I took, I was always weighing up how my dream of motherhood factored into that. So it'd be like, well, I can't be with this guy because of this, and I can't take that job because, maybe it wouldn't have the right maternity benefits, and this isn't the time to go and do, a master's because I need to focus on this, and I can't go and live abroad because, whatever it was, it was like this constant layer of decision making that was added to by motherhood. So it wasn't just, the idea that it's just about trying to make a baby and that then your life is going to change, once you have that baby. That hasn't been my experience, and it hasn't been the experience of the, many thousands of women, I've met and worked with through Gateway Women. I mean, I actually didn't grow up dreaming of motherhood. It wasn't something that I was desperate to do as a young child, because, my own childhood was quite disrupted and unhappy. And so for me, actually, kind of family life was something I didn't really want. I mean, when I met the man who became my husband, and we were kind of, starting to talk about getting married, I very much said to him, I don't think I want children, because I was still worried about, what family life meant. And then, luckily for me, he was like, oh, okay. And then luckily for me, when at 29, I kind of realized that actually having children didn't necessarily mean having my childhood, and said actually, and also children had gone from being this abstract idea to being actually something concrete. It would be the fusion of our DNA. They would be our children. That felt very, very different. And then I said, I would like to have a family. And he was like, oh, okay. These incredibly important discussions that we really didn't have. But, I tried and I wasn't able to conceive. I had an abortion when I was 21. I was terrified of becoming a mother at 21. What I had learned from my own upbringing, from the culture, from people at school, from everyone, was that this is true, that having children young ruins your life. This was the message that I got from school, that you had to kind of go out there, and I don't know if they say it anymore, but really what I heard all the time was I had to see the world. You had to see the world before sort of settling down and having a family. And so I did. Of all of the Barbie dolls that I played with, my favorite one was Air Hostess Barbie. I wanted to, I really did want to, she had a little sort of Pan Am little bag that she carried with her. And that was, I was going to see the world. And I have seen the world, but I also wanted to be a mum, and it didn't work out for me. So as well as the 15 years hoping and trying and planning and dreaming of becoming a mum, there was then the years that I lost to grief afterwards. And I didn't know it was grief. I didn't know that the sort of the devastating loss I was experiencing, the trauma of it did not respond to any of the kind of techniques that I knew of how to cope with difficult times. And I'd had a lot of difficult times in my life. I'd also dealt with, the trauma of, sort of losing my husband to addiction. And I don't mean as in he died, because luckily he didn't, but he kind of was lost to me, so I lost my best friend and my life partner at that time. And living through that is extremely traumatic. So I picked myself up from that, and I was moving forward again. But nothing that none of my techniques, therapy, looking on the bright side, whatever it might be, throwing myself into new projects, nothing touched this sadness and the deep, dark, existential nature of the loss. And also this sense of like, who was I as a woman? If it wasn't as a mother, I felt completely hollowed out. And at that point, which was 9 years ago now, if someone had said to me, if I had met me, as I am now, 9 years ago, looking, shiny and healthy and happy and just like, it's going to be fine, you're going to get through this, you're going to come out the other side, and, you can have a meaningful and fulfilling life. I would have just been, I have to say, I would have been extremely cynical. I would have probably thought, well, maybe you can. Or maybe I might have been more uncharitable than that. I might have thought, well, you obviously didn't really want kids, because if you can get over this, you didn't really want them, because there is no way that anything is ever going to help me through this sadness. So if that's where you are now, I do really, really understand. And this seminar, this whole week of We Are Worthy is about worthiness. And for me, I fundamentally felt that my worthiness as a human being, as a woman, was completely destroyed by my childlessness. And I felt that I had no internal or external resources available to me to create a plan B. At that point I was, I was 44 and a bit. I was emotionally, physically, spiritually, financially, so many ways. I felt kind of bankrupt, I finished as a human being. I just thought there is no way that from this point I have the resources necessary to create a new life. I thought, yeah, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, if you'd asked me as a feisty, young woman in her 20s, if you'd asked me as an optimistic, hardworking woman in her 30s, maybe, but, as a kind of broken, middle-aged woman, you know, felt like I'd been deserted by my family, my friends, society, you know, entering the perimenopause, not understanding what was going on. I was like, I thought of all the times in life to try and like create a new life. As they say in, you know, in Ireland, you know, the famous expression about asking for directions. Well, I wouldn't start from here. and Jen's laughing because it's like, it's got to be the least inspiring place to possibly start a new life. So I can see that joining me on the call, you can probably see on the video, Jen Smythe. And then we also have, Nikki Fletcher is from the We Are Worthy Summit, and she's basically our pilot on this webinar, this big adventure. Helen Burke is my assistant, and she is my co-pilot on the call this evening. And so if you have any questions about that you'd like to ask me, if on the chat screen on the right hand side, you'll see that there's a blue button where you can sort of direct your chat message, and you can either direct it to everyone or you can direct it to a specific person. If you direct it to Helen Burke, ask any questions of her, and then she will relay them to me and to us at the end of the call when we get to the Q&A part. So for me, I've spent a lot of time and written a book about helping women find their plan B. And really, what a plan B is often isn't what you think it's going to be. I mean, some women say to me, now I'm just going to do something. I'm just going to mute everyone because I was getting some strange feedback noise of someone typing. So what I was saying was that a plan B looks very different from what you expect, because a plan B is actually a shorthand way of saying creating a life of meaning that makes sense to you, that fulfills your identity as a woman in a way that is different from childlessness but equally fulfilling. As you can see, plan B is a lot shorter than that. And often there's this idea that a plan B is a really big thing, you know, that it's something that's visible from the outside. It's a new job. It's a kind of a new identity. It's kind of like another new shiny version of ourselves where we don't feel sad about our childlessness. It's like, okay, I want a fresh skin. I want a fresh go at life. You know, I want like a completely new me, you know, some kind of massive transformation. And yeah, wouldn't that be lovely, you know, if we could do that? In fact, I remember a retreat that I ran quite a few years ago on the Plan B process. And at the end of the retreat, one of the participants told me that she'd had this fantasy that at the end of the retreat, I was going to be giving out envelopes, and that in the envelope would be, you know, and your plan B is. And because it would be this idea that, you know, like Mission Impossible, because, you know, this idea, just tell me what to do. You know, you seem to have worked out, Jody, how to kind of reinvent yourself. And, you know, but, you know, can you have a go with my life? Because I just don't have any idea what to do. And I think it's really important to realize that no one else can work out your plan B for you, because it's not really a plan. It's a way of talking about the healing that takes place that enables us to show up in our life again in a way that feels bearable, that feels enjoyable, that makes sense to us, where we can kind of hold our head up high again as women and not feel less than, you know, something that actually my lovely assistant Helen said many years ago. As she, you know, she did this work with me. She was one of the early Gateway women. And thinking about it now, actually, she was at that retreat I was just talking about. And she said, my life doesn't feel like a booby prize anymore. You know, it doesn't feel like a sort of a lesser version. And I think that's what a plan B is. It's like, for me, my life doesn't feel better than the life of motherhood. It doesn't feel worse than a life that would have included motherhood. It's different. You know, my life is of equal value to the life of some, to the life I would have lived if I'd been a mum. And once you really feel that yourself, deep down in your bones, that is the core of worthiness that we need. And the plan B comes really as a process. It comes out of the identity change that occurs by going through the grief process, and preferably by going through the grief process with the support of others who've made that journey. Because there are very few stories yet out there of women like myself and like some of the guests I'm going to introduce you to, who have kind of made this transition and are living, life in their plan B. I mean, in the press, we hear stories, of women who've had fertility treatments and they haven't worked out and their life is kind of, destroyed. The idea that they'll never get over it. We have the stories of child-free by choice women who've chosen not to be mums, and who, everything is fantastic and wonderful, and why are all these childless women moping around? Because really it's just amazing, not having kids. But we have very few stories of women who have made it through this transition and now living their lives as childless women with a sense of worthiness and presence and peace. And that's what I call a plan B. So what I wanted to introduce you to Jen. And I'm going to put my nice middle-aged lady's glasses on now. So Jen, what it would be lovely is to hear a little bit about your story, about how you came to be childless, and what it's been like for, what your plan B looks like and feels like.
Hi everyone. So the short version of how I came to be a childless woman was that I didn't start trying for a baby till I was in my late 30s. And I was lucky enough to get pregnant 3 times and then unlucky enough to have 3 miscarriages. So I had my last miscarriage when I was 40. And I really resonated with how Jody, you were describing earlier on, at getting to a point where you just run out of everything. I was on there was 0 in the tank. And at 40, I lost all hope that I was going to have a biological child. And then my life went on freeze hold for about 2 years. I didn't really, I was grieving and I didn't recognize it as grief. I didn't understand what was going on. And then I heard you on the radio and booked and went on a Reignite weekend, which was amazing. And I guess for me, a fundamental step that I had to take in my plan B was, first of all, exactly as you were saying, because my middle name is Planny. Yeah. So, and I planned for so many years to get pregnant and sustain a pregnancy, and all that planning didn't work. So in a way, I had to really let go of planning, which was really, really hard, because I thought the plan B was the plan for me. So I had to, the first part of that was really about developing quite a deep level of self-compassion for myself and the difficult journey I'd been on. And fundamental in that was stopping blaming myself, because I really blamed myself. I thought I'd been a complete failure. And to be able to move on, I had to go through an internal shift and an internal process. So although at first the idea of a planned plan B, it brings a false comfort, really, because it's not really what my plan B was about. My plan B was almost going back to basics and trying to be the mother to myself that I would have been to my children if I'd had them. So self-compassion was a fundamental part of that, and everything else has grown out of that building block. So on the outside, my life is probably not that much different, but there's been a massive internal shift. I'm so much kinder to myself. I've got a lot more friends. I've really invested a lot in contact and friendships with other childless women, because they get it and they validate me and I validate them. And I think it's out of that self-compassion, and I use this word cautiously because there was a time in my life where if I'd said this is going to be part of your plan B, I probably would have, stormed out the room. But actually, out of self-compassion has grown a sense of gratitude for the life that I do have.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, I really resonate with that sense of my plan B has been about not having the booby prize, about actually realizing I have a fantastic life. But I've had to really feel it and grow into it again and take some risks as well. Because I was in such a damaged place. It was a real challenge to move forward.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's really important that that sense that a plan B doesn't always look that different on the outside.
Yeah.
But the way we feel inside is completely transformed.
Yeah.
There's a quote I often share from an author called Rainbow Roll, which is something like, what if you didn't fix your whole life? What if instead you just added things to your pile of good things and let the pile of good things grow?
Yeah.
And I sometimes feel that's a much more helpful and less, sort of less huge idea of a plan B.
Yeah.
It's just like, well, let me just put that one on the good pile and that one on the good pile.
Yeah.
And then one day there's more on the good pile.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And we move into that place, as you say, of gratitude and appreciation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Maybe our slightly quieter house than the big door slamming, rambunctious family home that we imagined. We start to actually find it really peaceful and appreciate it. It's a transition process, and it's also not, in my experience, it's not like, as you say, I was a ferocious planner as well. When I was trying to conceive, when I was like 29, 30, I had this kind of sort of handwritten type spreadsheet with the months and the years on it. I know it's in a box somewhere, with which month I was going to get pregnant, so that my children had compatible star signs with my husband.
Brilliant.
I'm just like, so, and also so that it fitted in, because I'd gone back to university, and so I wanted to make sure that I could have my baby in the long academic summer holidays.
Yeah.
When we were going to move to the country and all of this, and it's just like, oh my God.
Yeah.
And if there's one thing, well, childlessness has taught me many things, but goodness, life does not go according to plan.
Yeah.
And I think for me, childlessness was such a rude awakening of, how we are actually powerless sometimes over incredibly important things. It humbled me. Before that, I was one of those, I was an incredible striver. If there was something that needed to be done or something that needed to be achieved, I would put my head down and do my best to make it happen and write a lot of lists. And now I'm a lot less like that now, because it's like, I've surrendered to, the things I can have power over and the things I can't in this life. Yeah. So thank you for that. I'm gonna pop over to Lauren now, and you're live, Lauren. So thank you so much for joining us.
I made it in the end.
You were like wacky races driving across town to get to this. So thank you.
Yeah, and then I couldn't get on. Like I couldn't get the video bit. So
well, I had to do something at this end, but it's kind of difficult for me to do that whilst I was also talking to Jen, and it's the first time I've kind of tried to drive a webinar. It's I've got
I'm very glad to be here.
Panel going on. So I just wondered if you wanted to share with the viewers and listeners a little bit about how you came to be a childless woman, and sort of what Plan B means to you and where you are in that process.
Okay, so I'm one of those women where I actively decided not to have children up until my early 30s, I'd say. My own childhood wasn't great, and I was petrified I would become the same mother as my own. So I didn't want to repeat the pattern. And then I had a bit of an aha moment, met a guy who said all right things. It was all music to my ears, said yes, he wanted more children. He had 2 of his own already. And then but kept saying, not yet, not yet, not yet. And then 3 years on, the not yet became a no, by which time I was 35. And then I had a series of relationships, and I just didn't feel like the partner that I had chosen was suitable. And I wasn't brave enough to be a single mum either. I didn't want to do that. And then finally, in my early 40s, I had a partner. We went for the adoption process, and 9 months in, we were turned down.
Yeah.
And
9 months in.
Yeah. And it was so painful, because that was the point where I realised that was my hitting the wall bit of realising, actually, I'm not going to ever have my own family. I'm not even going to be able to look after someone else's child and bring them up as my own either. So it's kind of like, that was it.
Because in a way, adoption was already a little bit of a plan B.
Yeah, it was a little bit, actually, yes. It was like my kind of last ditch attempt to try and have a family. So when someone said, no, that's not going to happen, I really, really hit a wall. And I think the way that I reacted is I just kind of numbed out, just zoned out of life. And because it was so painful, I just didn't know what to do with myself. Suddenly that door that was just slightly ajar had slammed shut. And I found it so hard to kind of get over that. And I think some of it was around the actual adoption process as well. It was very harsh how it was done. And I felt a real sense of unfairness about it all, that somebody had decided my future life wasn't going to be with bringing up a family. So yeah, so that was really painful. And then I think I just kind of was like, I didn't have a terrible life. I can't say I had a terrible life, but I can't say I had a great life either. It was just like just plateaued at some kind of nothingness, really. And then finally, a couple of years ago, I just thought, I can't be the only woman in the world that feels like this. And I Googled childlessness, found gateway women, and really feel now that I've got a plan B underway. And like you were saying earlier, it's for me, it's coming from the sort of inside and then coming out. But it's starting from the inside. And I have this, for me, I think the game changer was self-care. And it's not in magnificent big magic ways. It's little things. Like I was thinking yesterday, it's like I make sure there's flowers in my flat at all times now, whether someone buys them for me or I buy them for myself. They're there all the time because they bring me absolute joy every day that I look at them. So it doesn't have to be a huge, massive thing, but it's for me, it's the difference that makes the difference in my life. And having that sort of self-care has enabled me to really sort of develop that. And I think one of the big ways for me about my plan B is that I have become quite selective over the company that I keep now. And again, that to me is big stuff about self-care.
I mean, that's a form of self-care, isn't it, really?
Yeah, I think so. I really do. And it means I have lovely quality of people around me now, for the most part. I haven't kind of sussed it entirely, but for the most part is there. And it's also actually freed me up, because I realised what I was doing is I was seeing people who weren't particularly nourishing and inspiring for me, but it was a distraction. And it was a distraction against me, it occupied my time essentially, because I didn't know what else to do. And now that means that I've got more time, and I'm doing things like I'm reading a lot more that I used to do when I was younger, and that I haven't done for 10 years plus. I'm starting to read a lot more again. And it's also given me a real and the way that I think it's emerging outwards from the inside is that I'm really starting to kind of say, this is me. You know, I'm a woman, I'm 54, and I happen to be childless, and I love cats, and I love art, and there's lots and lots of things about me, and being childless is just one of those aspects. And I'm really starting to talk about it a lot more with other people. I've got childless friends, and up until last year, it was the massive elephant in the room that we never, ever, we just walked round the elephant. We never talked about it, ever. And yet we could have been such support for one another, but we just didn't.
Yeah, I mean, I hear that a lot. It becomes sort of almost impossible to talk about, and then, you know, maybe we have a friend who is a woman without children, and maybe they presume about us that we chose it, and we presume about them, and no one really talks about it. Or you do try to talk about, you know, and use words like grief or plan B, and they're just like, whoa, you know, that's not me, you know. So it's, we can only really, we each have to be ready, you know, to make this transition. Because, you know, I've met with and worked with women, you know, in their 70s and even in their late 70s, who've come to kind of Gateway Women Reignite weekends, who have been holding on to this sadness, to this grief, you know, their entire adult lives. And there has been nowhere safe for them to open up about it. So, you know, it's not less, you know, because time does not heal grief.
No.
Only grieving heals grief. If you don't have a space to do this work and to have these conversations and to hear that, you know, those Me Too moments, oh wow, then it's very, very hard to move through it.
And you can't do this stuff on your own either. That's a big learning curve for me as well, that you cannot grieve on your own and get beyond that grief.
Yeah, it was a huge revelation for me, and you know, it's a huge part of, you know, what Gateway Women is about, because grief is a social emotion. It is a form of love. It is only love that creates grief. So, you know, and I think of the grief that we experience as childless women, which is a form of grief called disenfranchised grief, which is not allowed to be spoken of, not allowed to be in relationship, as like unrequited grief. You know, unrequited love is this incredibly painful form of love, and I feel our grief is almost like an unrequited grief. But and until we can come into contact with others who understand it, who kind of can look us in the eyes, and we know that they know what we're talking about, what we're feeling, then it starts to process and change and heal. And I'm just gonna unmute Jen. I mean, Jen, what do you think about the links between sort of the grieving process and Plan B?
I would say for me, there's definitely been a correlation between the amount of, if you want to call it grief work, and the development of my Plan B, that they've gone hand in hand. And I know sometimes women who I've spoken to have said, oh, can I skip the grief work and just go straight to the Plan B? But for me, it just hasn't been. There has been a direct relationship between those. And some of the things that I've found very difficult in the past, but particularly other people's children, that has really mellowed, I do think, directly in proportion to the amount of grief work that I've done. So almost like voyaging into that really sore, tender point. And holding it, but interestingly, in a way, I think I know I keep talking about self-compassion, but in a way, because I developed like my self-compassion muscle, that enabled me to do the grief work, because I was grieving with a compassion, you know, a gentleness to the grief, and so that really helped. And I've done lots of different grief work. I've built grief shrines. I loved my grief shrine so much, it's now a permanent fixture, and it's being added to every time, you know, I lose an animal, the animal's ashes go on the grief shrine. So but in a way, it's like, I almost feel like the more you plummet the depths, the more you spring forth, you know, a bit like gardening. The more you dig down and get the roots out, the more your plants, you know, come up and grow again.
I mean, something you just said, someone emailed a question in foot to me, which was very much about, you know, is plan B a sort of a good way to kind of, you know, to do your grief work, which is a sort of similar question to what you're saying. Could, like, you know, can I just jump to my plan B? And I'd love to say yes. And I think many of us try to do that because, you know, grief, a lot of us don't know that we're grieving. We don't, you know, what is this grief work? Well, what am I supposed to do? And there's this desire to kind of to take action, you know, and it feels like, well, I need to make a change, you know, where I need to change my job. I need to move countries. I need to leave my partner. I need to find my partner. I need to change my partner, whatever it is. But there's this really strong desire to kind of, you know, do something to get ourselves out of this terrible pain that we're in. And this, you know, that's what everyone's telling us, you know, just buck up.
Yeah.
You know, and you just think, well, okay, I'll just buck up. Could someone just tell me how to do that?
Yeah.
You know, if there was a getting over it, bucking up pill, we'd all have taken it. And also, if it was possible, like you said, Lauren, to do it on our own, in our heads, in our homes, well, we'd all be fine because we've all tried that.
Yeah.
You know, grief needs to be in relationship. And one of the very common things that happens, and I certainly had it too, and I've kind of called it, I write about it in my book, the Mother Teresa fantasy. And this is often a very common transition, kind of an early sort of plan B kind of thinking process. And this was mine. I was going to give up all of my possessions and sort of give everything away. I was going to move to Laos, which is this little tiny Buddhist country in between Cambodia and Thailand and Vietnam. I was going to go and work in an orphanage on the Mekong Delta. I was going to spend my whole life there. And when I died, I was going to be floated down the Mekong River on a sort of funeral pyre covered in flowers, all in flames. There would be this little paragraph in the South Sea China News about this extraordinary, eccentric English woman who dedicated her life to these orphans. There would be a picture of me with these long grey plaits. I was going to be really thin. I had the whole thing mapped out. And then when I kind of started to, you know, really think about it, I thought, well, I realised I hadn't actually thought anything about the orphans at all. It was nothing to do with them. By the way, this orphanage doesn't exist except in my mind. It's not like it's a place. And I realised that it was this desire to do something huge and incredibly self-sacrificing. You know, I wanted to kind of do something enormous with my life as a way to compensate for motherhood. You know, that my plan B was going to be this, you know, this incredible sort of self-sacrificial thing. And reflecting back on it, I realized that it was partly because I wanted to claim for myself those kind of qualities that people associate with motherhood and I felt were denied to me, of being loving and giving and nurturing and selfless and sacrificing. And also I wanted to make my loss so visible. You know, I wanted to do something so out of this world extraordinary that people would say, yeah, well, you know, Jody couldn't, you know, she couldn't have children, she couldn't become a mother. And so she did this. You know, it was almost like I wanted my sadness to be so visible. And I hear about, and so I called it the Mother Teresa complex, because as I started, you know, meeting other childless women through the early days of Gateway Women, I heard other stories like this. And some women actually, you know, did them. You know, they left their jobs and went to work for NGOs. They've retrained as, you know, as nurses and things like that. And some of them are, you know, are the right choices. But quite a few of them were kind of, in a way, trying to make the plan B process take place with the grief. And so, of course, they you know, they didn't work, because actually the energy in, you know, behind it wasn't quite the energy to sustain it. And actually, as we transition through the grief process, which is a process of identity transformation, that's what grief is, the painful process of identity transformation. The person who comes out the other end of it is not the person who goes into it. So one of the things I say to women who are kind of on, you know, Plan B groups and stuff like that is try not to make any irrevocable decisions right now whilst you're grieving, because the person you're making decisions for is a version of you haven't yet met. You know, so what might feel right now in a couple of years' time might not sit with you. Yeah. So I see that Petra has joined us on the call. Petra is dialing in from America, so I'm going to make Petra a co-host, which means hopefully we'll be able to see her video. We'll see what happens. But before that happens, I wondered if we had any questions coming in. I've seen the chat screen's been rolling and rolling, but I can't look over there as well. Helen, do you want to speak out sort of a few of the questions that we can talk about?
Yeah, sure. We've had quite a lot of questions around grief work, and whether you can give some other examples of what grief work actually is.
Okay, well, grief work is it's actually quite a clumsy phrase to encapsulate basically sort of nurturing your grief, paying attention to it, making space for it in your life, seeking out the resources you need to support you to grieve. And in the case of childless, not by choice women, I'd say the number one piece of grief work is finding other childless women to talk about your sadness with, who won't kind of close you down with a miracle baby story, who won't tell you, oh, don't you think you're wallowing in this? Or don't you think you ought to be over that by now? I mean, a very powerful piece of grief work might be to create a reading group where, you know, you come together and you work through my book. You know, and you do the exercises together. It might be joining a Gateway Women meetup. Hi, Petra. It might be joining a Gateway Women meetup or the Gateway Women online community. It could be, you know, some of the stuff that Jen was talking about, which is, you know, using creativity to memorialize your grief work. Because one of the very difficult aspects of our loss is that it can be intangible. I mean, some of us do, you know, if we've had, you know, miscarriages and things like that, or sometimes there are some physical remains, or there may be a photograph of an embryo or something like that. But often there can be nothing but a dream, you know, and making that tangible in some way by creating a shrine, by planting a tree, you know, that can be grief work too. So, I mean, Lauren, what would you say, you know, examples of grief work?
Well, I really like the doing symbolic things. So I really like that. I think in the West, we're really bad at dealing with grief overall. You know, in places like China, they often have, don't they even have candles that they burn for their lost babies? And, you know, it's really embraced in a way that the West doesn't seem to want to do. And I think that ritual thing, writing down how sad you are as well, writing a letter to yourself, writing a letter to the children you didn't have, it's very powerful, I think, because there needs to be a huge acknowledgement. But I agree with you, Jody. I think the real powerful thing is being heard.
And it's the conversation, that sense that grief is a dialogue, not a monologue.
Yeah, absolutely.
It has to, I mean, like, for example, the writing letters thing. One of the things that I say in my book is when you do that, is if possible to have that witnessed.
Yeah.
You know, so when you go to the place where you read the letter out loud and then you kind of either burn it or rip it up or float it down a river, to have that witnessed. Because it's that sense of it being heard. And one Gateway woman I know, she made these just gorgeous paper little sort of origami boats out of her letters, and then floated them down a river and took a video of it, and then shared that video on the Gateway Women online community. So in a way, she was single and childless. She didn't feel there was someone she could share that moment with, but she found a way to have it witnessed. And then there was an incredible conversation that came up around that was really healing for her. So it's like, how can we get creative about that?
Yeah.
So I just want to pop over to Petra, and thank you for joining us, Petra, all the way from San Francisco at a shocking time in the morning.
I'm in New York actually now.
So yes, I can't keep up.
My crazy loft. Yeah. Hello, everyone.
If you could share a little bit about, your, how you came to be childless and what Plan B means to you. Because in a way we talk about how for Jen and Lauren it's been an internal shift, but perhaps life doesn't look so much different on the outside. And for you, I think your outside life has been changing quite a lot too, hasn't it?
Yeah, both has, but it's definitely the internal shift. And by the way, I was listening in the background, so
Okay.
I've heard you since the beginning of the talk.
Okay.
I ended up in my situation through the ambivalence situation when I was growing up through my 20s. I grew up in New York City, so I was around a lot of just the hustle of career and the influence of you can do it all. And I just sort of put everything on the back burner of family, and it just wasn't in the front of my agenda. So when I guess my situation is really one of circumstance, and I didn't really hit the question of my infertility and of motherlessness or not being a mother. It's kind of both in my case, actually. But when I hit 40, I had a really huge breakup with a guy whose reason for breaking up with me was that I was over 35.
Wow.
And it just really hit home that we hadn't even tried. It wasn't really a question. It was just sort of taken away from me. And so my life spiraled into sort of a crazy state because I wasn't prepared for that. And I was heartbroken. Yeah. And I lost a lot of the things that I thought were going to be givens for somebody who worked so hard to build two careers, not one, but two careers. I was a fashion designer here in New York that did pretty well, put a roof over my head. I had a band that was successful. And, I felt like somebody who had followed my dreams, and then I got punished.
Yeah.
So I was really angry. So my grief periods, which started at 40, it really lasted about 8 years until I met Jody. So it was kind of this arc. I'm now 50. And so I would say my life was stuck for a really long time. Yeah. And it was unidentified grief, which again, as some people have already said, it makes it very hard to heal. Naming it helped very much. But, I was stuck in moments where I remember getting on planes and I was traveling and doing lots of things and keeping myself pretty busy, but always feeling quite numb and confused and lost and alone. And I couldn't talk about it with other people because they just say, well, you don't look your age. You can find someone else and everything's going to be fine for you. So everyone kept pushing the grief away for me and not acknowledging it. And that just made it worse. And then there's another layer, which is that in America, the culture has suddenly shifted. Not suddenly, it's been a slow rising boil of now we are so much a mommy culture.
Yeah.
Where everybody gets the mommy card for everything. And suddenly I realized my culture had another agenda for me when, whereas I was raised with feminism, suddenly that wasn't going to do it for me anymore. And suddenly now I had a second-class citizenship, which I didn't really bargain for in the first place. So I was very angry. My grief was manifested in anger, which can be good. And if there isn't a chance to express it or move forward, it turns to depression. So I think I was just really, really having a hard time. And I do remember the worst point, the lowest point. I was in an airplane. I was dating a guy who was a pilot, and it was kind of a dangerous situation. And I just didn't care. I thought, well, you know what? I'm having an adventure. I'm living my life. And if this goes down, it's okay. I don't really deserve to live. I mean, it really did feel like everything's going to be fine. I can do whatever I want now because, and I don't think that's.
It sounds like you didn't feel your life was valuable.
No, I didn't feel valuable. I didn't. I felt like it was okay. If you know, this will be fine. I'm all right with it. And okay, that's coming to terms with one's own death is an interesting place to be. But mine was from a sense of low self-esteem that had gotten so low.
This is the webinar series is about we are worthy. It's that sense of
I know, and it's yeah, and I don't even think I've told you that story before, so this is kind of new, but it really hit me that you know, I mean, it's a terrible place to be, and especially when you're all alone and you don't know what is going on. So I feel like I definitely I don't know. Can you help me come around to where we want to talk about? I was talking about the grief.
I wanted to talk a little bit about, you know, what your plan B looks like now and what it is inhabiting it, because we've talked about the internal shifts, and it's interesting to hear a little bit more about sort of how that's manifesting in your life and what you're doing differently.
Okay. Yeah, well, first I will say that the grief work that we did when I did a Reignite weekend is hard. It's not easy, and it's not something I wanted to do, and it's not something that I thought I needed, because on one layer I was like, well, I'm fine. I don't need to, you know. So there's a lot of denial that's around all this, and it's awkward and it's confusing. So these are all things that happen that are part of the shift, and they don't happen overnight. But I think by the time I met you, Jody, and we did the work together, I was ready. So it actually happened quite quickly for me, because it had been sort of brewing, and I was looking and trying to connect with people and get there. And the work that you did and reading your book just gave me the aha and the permission, and naming it again. Naming it was everything for me, because then you're just like, oh, that's what that is. And you can sort of, you know, do what you need to do, you know, cry or whatever. And then you can start to put it in a box and express it and let that anger have a form, and meet other people who are also dealing with it in their different ways and how it has shaped their lives. And you can build from somewhere. But before, you're in quicksand. You're in quicksand of your own.
You talked about sort of being stuck, and
yeah.
I know
so what I
talked about. How did you describe it before, Lauren? I'm trying to remember. It wasn't in limbo. You had a way of describing it. Was it on pause or mute or something?
Somebody else. I'm stealing this phrase actually from someone else, but I thought it was such a good one. It was so apt. You just kept pressing the snooze button.
Yeah. That kind
and I have a story similar to Petra's as well about the pilot, which was that before I knew I was grieving, I thought I would go and work in Kabul, because there was this opportunity to work with this organization in Kabul that was helping local crafts jewelers kind of get their businesses going again, and teach them about marketing and get their products sold in the West, and help these crafts people whose livelihoods have been destroyed by the war kind of get back on their feet. And I had a sort of design background and a marketing background, and I thought, yeah, so I was kind of lining up this contract, and I was meant to be starting in the spring. And then the person I was taking it over from, she actually was going to be staying and leaving. So the contract was going to start in October. And I've spent enough time, particularly in India, in the winter, sort of, I know what sort of countries that are built for the heat are like in the winter in the developing world. And I knew that I'd be sort of in a concrete sort of room with kerosene heaters. It'd be freezing cold outside. It'd be boiling hot inside, fumes. I just thought, oh God, I can't. So I sort of said that, I turned it down. And my best friend said to me, so you're fine with the idea of being blown up, but you just don't want to be cold. And I was like, yeah, because actually, you know, the idea of being blown to smithereens really didn't bother me. I thought it would actually kind of be a bit of a relief. You know, it's like I wasn't actively seeking annihilation, but I thought if I kind of happened into it, it wouldn't be the worst thing that could happen. You know, that was how my grief was churning around in the background before I understood what it was. Yeah.
I think you can get so weary with your own grief that you can't even be actively caring about it. Do you know what I mean? Which is why, like, well, if I'm blown up, I'm blown up.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just going to have a look because we're having some questions coming through, and there's another little button down here which I've never seen before, which is called a Q&A button. Let me just have a look. So we have, I was wondering whether Jody could say more about coming to terms with childlessness, coming up with a plan B at the same time as the breakdown of your relationship with your partner. We can look at that. Another person, I'm working my way through the book. I'm finding that I'm already very aware of the things I've enjoyed doing in my life and have continually practiced them, but they don't feel significant enough to be an alternative to having been a parent. I think those are really, you know, those are really helpful questions. You know, what's it like doing this when you're in a partnership? And actually the second question is from someone who actually shares that she's, you know, been single for large periods of time. And it's this idea, you know, that doing things that you enjoy, that's what a plan B is. Jen's not here right now. I mean, Lauren, do you want to talk a little bit about, you know, the relationship side of things, about what it's like trying to do this within a partnership, and how, a little bit about your personal story there, if that's helpful, if you can?
Yeah, well, I think, well, what's springing to mind is my last relationship ended last September, and I think it was no coincidence that I was on the year-long plan B, that it happened during that period. And I think what it was is I had chosen him because it was just easy. It was low risk. He wasn't really my potential soulmate. And we'd known each other a long time. So it was more like a kind of friendship, really. So again, it was low risk because I felt so hurt by not having my own family that it was almost like I didn't want any more pain. So rather than risk a relationship which might end up being painful for me, so it's like another layer of pain for me, I just chose this low level, it was okay. And I finally realized what I'd done last year. And so, and I realized that that's just not a good reason to be in a relationship. It's not a good enough reason, not for me anyway. And so I finished the relationship, and we've now morphed back into being the friends that we were before. But that, and I was with my last partner for 8 years. So it can have a huge effect on your relationships with.
I mean, something I've heard a lot from women who are kind of going through this process, you know, whilst in partnerships is, and this is really difficult in relationships, whether it's, you know, because the grieving process, as I've said, is a process of identity transformation. Now, within a partnership, and this also includes, you know, lesbian partnerships as well as heterosexual partnerships, because you know, lesbian couples and the lesbian experience is so often completely left out of the childlessness experience, because it's this idea, I think it's another layer of othering of the lesbian experience, that maybe they didn't want children or something like that. So this is something that happens in, you know, in all committed partnerships, that as one part of the couple starts to change, this has a huge impact on the other one. And even if the change is actually an improvement, they're starting to feel better, they're starting maybe to meet new friends, you know, they're starting to connect with other childless women, maybe, you know, things like that. It's like, this changes the equilibrium in the relationship. And even if the equilibrium was not a happy one, once one person starts shifting it, do you know what I mean? The whole thing gets very wobbly. And something I've noticed a lot is that when one partner gets the support that they need to start doing the grief work / moving towards their plan B, that the other person, who may, usually the man, who's been kind of holding on to it for a very long time, kind of holding it together. I mean, I do see this in lesbian partnerships as well. I've more kind of context of knowing about it in heterosexual ones, is that the guy's been kind of holding it together, maybe not showing how impacted he's been by this, you know, by the childlessness. And then his partner starts to feel a bit better, and then he kind of really starts to feel his grief. And that can be really confusing as well, because it's like, actually there can be quite a lot of anger at this point, because it's like, well, where was your pain 5 years ago when I was lying on the kitchen floor weeping, you know, and you seem to be fine about this? And so that, you know, that can be really hard too. I mean, and Petra, I mean, what do you think about the context of trying to move towards your plan B within a relationship?
Oh, I definitely think that it's brought up a lot of questions. I mean, I didn't try to have, I mean, I didn't go for kids with the man that I've been with for about 6 years. I was very clear from the beginning. I didn't, you know, I was already mid-40s, and I didn't even want to go through, I wasn't going to do IVF. And I wasn't ready to even, I mean, I just basically chose a partner who didn't want kids. And that would just be easy, and I wouldn't have to bring it up. And there was one point in the relationship where I think he was testing me, and he sort of made some allusion to, well, wouldn't it be nice if, and that just did it for me. This is before I met you, Jody, but it was really, really hard for me to handle the fact that he could still be wondering.
He still had that option.
Yeah. And it made me really, really nervous and insecure in the relationship. And it hasn't quite healed that. So I think since I've been doing the work, you know, because I don't know really where he's coming from at this point. And I feel like I've been doing the work, and I'm okay with it. I'm okay with the outcome. So having the community and the strength to heal from within has given me well, whatever happens, this will either work or it won't work. I don't have to be invested in a relationship to make myself feel whole, or being a mother to make myself feel whole. This is about making a relationship with yourself and doing the work and finding community where you fit in and people understand you. And that to me has given me, every time, the grief work works. But I will say that you'll have moments where not a good day, and suddenly you think you'll have those insecure feelings come back, and I'm not good enough, I don't deserve this. Something will trigger you, because there's so many messages in our culture and in the world right now that are anti-feminine, anti-woman, anti-equality. And so you're going to get triggered. And that's why this work is so important, because you have it to go back to, and it's a muscle you must work on for probably the rest of our lives.
Yeah, thank you for that. We started a little bit late, so we've gone over time, but I know that we need to be wrapping up. Helen, are there any other questions that you've seen coming up?
There's been a few questions about Plan B, and how do you work on something that feels quite modest, or you know, is not kind of a life-changing thing, but can still have meaning to you?
Okay. Well, we talked about that a little bit at the beginning, and I think that's an extremely important point, because a plan B doesn't have to be a big deal. There is no reason why somehow we have to have this huge, ambitious project because we're childless. I mean, if you were going to have a huge, ambitious project when you were, you know, and be a mother, and you're an ambitious woman, and you have big ideas for things, great. And if you're not, great. You know, just because we're childless, we don't have anything to prove, because there's nothing wrong with us. You know, we are worthy of, as human beings, we were born worthy. You know, our childlessness does not take that away from us. And the healing that is part of the plan B is actually really owning that again, which is actually, I'm valuable, I matter, my voice matters, my experience matters, my life matters, you know, and the way we really feel that is by finding other women like us who reflect that back to us. And if your life is good, if what makes you happy is a quiet and small and decent and private, you know, life, that is wonderful, because I think the work of being a happy and peaceful childless woman, you know, it's always, as Petra said, it's always going to be work on the inside. We're always going to be having to push back against these pro-natalist messages coming from the culture that somehow we are worth less than mothers. So there's always that internal work we need to do. It's almost like house cleaning. We've always got to keep cleaning house on that one, or the kind of, you know, the dirt builds up. But how it looks on the outside, that's going to vary from each of us. Each of us would have been very different mothers, and each of us are going to be very different childless women. You know, we're each wonderfully complex individuals, and that's fine. I'm going to bring the webinar to a close, and I wanted to say thank you so much to Lauren and to Petra for being on the call, and Jen, who was with us earlier. And thank you so much to Nikki and Andrew Fletcher and to Brandy Little for organising the summit. Thank you so much. I just want to let you know that when the webinar recording is available to watch again, the information that came up in the chat screen won't be visible. So if you kind of put personal stuff in there during the call, don't worry, that won't be visible afterwards. And thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to our sponsors and wherever you are in the world. I just want you to know, you know, we are worthy. Thank you.